Welcome again, everyone. We're going to continue our Lenten series looking at the cost of discipleship. What is the cost of discipleship, and based on some of the teachings from Dietrich Bonhoeffer's book, The Cost of Discipleship. And we're going to look at, today's theme is discipleship and the cross. And that particular chapter, he starts out with this passage in Mark 8, which is what we read as our gospel reading. I'll give you again the first verse there, verse 31. He says, "Then Jesus began to teach them that the Son of Man must undergo great suffering and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the scribes, and be killed, and after 3 days rise again." So there's two big words here to pay attention to in this passage. The first one is suffering. Right? God's plan requires suffering. There's no way around it. And there's no way to get around it. And the thing with the suffering is that what the word with it is must. It must happen. It is required. It is essential. It is necessary. But notice how Jesus doesn't try to qualify it or sort of distance himself from it. He doesn't say, well, unfortunately, I guess I'm going to have to suffer and be rejected. He doesn't say, guys, I really was trying to work out some other way, but I guess this is what we're going to have to settle with. He just says it must happen. It is part of God's plan. And he didn't, of course, have to do this. We have to remember that Jesus, in many ways, set the whole thing up for himself. He didn't have to go to Jerusalem. He didn't have to go during the Passover when there's a ton of pilgrims and Rome sends in tons of extra soldiers to try to prevent a riot. So Jesus is walking in when political tensions are super high. He didn't have to do that. He didn't have to go to Jerusalem at all. I mean, he could have just avoided it, and he probably would have been fine. And even then, even when they started coming for him, the Garden of Gethsemane, it sits up kind of on a hill opposite the city. He would have been able to see the guys coming up, the soldiers coming after him, because it says they had torches. And he could have looked down, and there's actually a path. You can still see it today. He could have just snuck over the hill and off into the countryside. They wouldn't have caught him. He could have avoided it. He could have cut and run. He chose not to. Essentially, he is owning the path. Now, the second word here to pay attention to is rejected. In the grand plan and the grand scheme of things, it isn't just enough that Jesus suffer and die. He has to be rejected while doing it. And he has to be rejected by the most holy people in his religion. The priests, the elders, the scribes, the people in charge of the temple and in charge of the word and in charge of the traditions and the sacrifices. Those are the people that are going to reject the Son of God. And the rejection is as essential here as the suffering. It's one of those ideas that Bonhoeffer pointed out to me that I guess I didn't digest in the same way. You read it and you go, yeah, he's going to get rejected and suffer, yeah. But when you think about it, if you really sit and think about it, one does not have to be rejected to suffer. One can die a hero. One can go down in flames, nobly, with honor, for a valiant cause. One can go down and have people giving accolades and parades and honor after they die. And there's nothing wrong with that kind of sacrifice. People go into the service, they get in a POW camp, they come back, they should be honored for that sacrifice, right? They should be honored for what they did. So we think of those noble deaths and noble sacrifices, and we want to put Jesus in that category. So when Jesus tells his disciples that he must suffer and be rejected, of course, what happens? Peter hears it, and Peter is the guy who always says out loud what the others are thinking quietly. Peter gets a bum rap. I guarantee you the rest of them are all thinking it too. And he says, "No, Jesus, don't do that. Don't let it happen." And then Jesus, of course, tells him to get behind him. What is Peter so afraid of? Is it the suffering or is it the rejection? Well, I'm sure the suffering is part of it. He loves Jesus, doesn't want to see him die. If Peter thought that he was going to make himself king, if that was where Jesus was headed, or that Jesus was going to lead the valiant resistance effort, like a lot of rebel leaders, he could have gone down in suffering, trying to overthrow. I mean, you think of how many dictators in the world spin a narrative of how much suffering they did before I came here. You know, Mao did his long march and milked it every day until he died. Look at what I endured for the sake of the people. Look at what a noble sacrifice I made. Now you're going to starve to death while I live in a palace. Shh, don't talk about that, right? But it's still heroic. If you go down for the cause, it's heroic. But rejection, now that's another thing. Yeah, that's the kind of, to go down being hated and disdained and mocked, to go down being the one who dies, where people cheer on your death because they hate you that much. When you get no honor and no valor, what do you get instead? People filling the comment section with goodbye and good riddance. Should have happened earlier. Wish I could have done it. We're better off now without you. You become a pest to be stamped out. That's how Jesus died. Remember his charges? They were corrupting the youth and teaching people not to follow the traditions. He was ruining the children and going against our traditions, going against our culture and our way of life. And he didn't die with supporters waving or cheering him on. In fact, the people were cheering on his death. And they were glad when he was gone, and his supporters ran for cover. Well, his mom stayed around. I don't know if you guys remember, it's what happens, all of this is what happens when you decide to go out and you're going to stand up for somebody who is also hated. You take on the abuse that they get. We learn this in school as little kids, right? You learn it in high school. If you sit with the unpopular people, you become unpopular. If you hang out with the bullied ones, you get bullied. If you speak up for the refugees, they call you unpatriotic. Or in Bonhoeffer's day, if you stand up for the Jews, you will die with the Jews. You don't go down a hero, you go down crushed like a traitor. You suffer and are rejected. And the difference between those kind of deaths, it's immense. In one death, you embrace the cause. In the other, you die hated by the people you loved. So many portrayals of Jesus these days want to make him a noble hero. I mean, I think we all kind of instinctively want to do that. Do you remember those old shirts? I don't know, maybe they made them, I don't know if I haven't seen them for a while, like maybe kind of 10, 20 years ago, something like that. You would see it would say, God's Jim, his pain, your gain. And it was kind of like Gold's Gym. It was kind of a play on that. And it would show a Jesus, like the most muscular, ripped Jesus you've ever seen. I mean, this guy trained better than Lou Ferrigno and The Rock, right? You know, and you could see every ab, and he's ripping the chains, and the blood's pouring, and he's flexing like this. And I'm like, man, where do you think a guy who was a third world peasant carpenter had that access to that many protein shakes and a personal trainer? Of course, that's not the point, right? The point is to show him as strong, not weak, as standing up and tough, not humiliated in his underwear. It's to make him the hero, the martyr, the valiant, selfless sacrificer. And we know, of course, intellectually, that his own people rejected him. But I think it's easy to kind of say, well, that was just an in the past kind of thing. I mean, we know he got rejected, but, I wouldn't have rejected him. I would totally not have rejected him. I mean, if I was sitting there in the crowd and it was him or Barabbas, I totally would have been the one person with Jesus' mom chanting for Jesus. I would have been that person. I definitely would not have been angry that he was proposing revisions to the sacred law of God that held our people together. No. I would have supported all the change. I would not have been the one worried about the effects of his teachings with women and what that was going to do to our system of family and authority. If I was there, I for sure would have not thought that he was unpatriotic and was going to get us all killed. And if it was me, I would have totally been happy to see him going to parties with the tax collectors who just took half my farm. And I would have been overjoyed to support him forgiving the adulteress who slept with my husband. Because that's the way we always want to see ourselves. We want to be the good guy in the story. We want to imagine that when the huge mob is there, oh yeah, I would have been that one lone voice, for sure. We never think of ourselves as the ones falling into the trap of doing the persecuting and the hating of the prophet that God sends us because that prophet is speaking something that maybe we don't really want to hear. We never think that we would be the one who'd get mad at the Messiah for the compassion that he shows to those that we don't normally want to be around. We don't see ourselves like that because that would mean that we would have to look around the world and look at the people who are hated and loathed and despised and treated like they're pests to be eradicated or removed and say, am I really with the good guy on this one? How do I really know that I'm the one on God's side? How do I know those people are not? If Jesus is the hero who suffers but is not rejected, the suffering is noble, and I am not challenged to embrace the call to discipleship that will take me to the side of the hated one. I like Jesus dying for me, just not asking me to be an outcast. So I'll give you a couple quotes from Bonhoeffer here. Give him in his own words. I tend to bring him in towards the end, because if you read him in the beginning, he's a little bit like Paul. He's a little bit dense, but very good. He says, here the call to follow is closely connected with Jesus' prediction of the Passion. Jesus Christ must suffer and be rejected. The must is inherent in the promise of God. The Scripture must be fulfilled. And he continues, there is a distinction here between suffering and rejection. Had he only suffered, Jesus might have been applauded as the Messiah. All the sympathy and admiration of the world might have been focused on his passion. It could have been viewed as a tragedy with its own intrinsic value, dignity, and honor. But in the Passion, Jesus is a rejected Messiah. His rejection robs the Passion of its halo of glory. It must be a passion without honor. That's a lot to digest. But I'll tell you, Bonhoeffer opened my eyes to that part that I had glossed over, the need to embrace rejection. I got caught up on the suffering. Of course, we all do. We're human. And I've struggled for years with the idea of what it means for Jesus to have died, why he died, what does that mean for sins, and what does his sacrifice mean? Everybody has their theological thing that they kind of get stuck on and obsessed about. That's been mine. But I really feel like when I read this, it opened my eyes. And it opened my eyes because it doesn't feel good to embrace this kind of thinking. That the call to discipleship is not a call to heroism and honor, but to be hated because you love those who are hated. For Bonhoeffer, it was clear who he was talking about. It was the Jewish people, right? They were getting blamed for all the country's problems, and they were despised, and people felt little remorse watching them get moved away. There were no big crowds of Germans trying to block the trains. So who should I embrace? Who do I hate? Who do I want to see gone? Who is despised today and blamed for our woes that maybe I should befriend and have dinner with? The call to discipleship asks these questions. It requires it. It must be. Amen.